who are joining us via Zoom. This is the open meeting portion of the Conflicts of Interest Board meeting, and today in this open meeting we'll be considering amendments to two rules of the Conflicts of Interest Board. One, section 4-05, dealing with the dates for candidates who wish to receive matching funds to file their financial disclosure forms with the Conflict of Interest Board, and the other deals with an update of the rules relating to the permissible appearances of members of the city's City Planning Commission. For this purpose, the purpose of this open meeting, I'm going to designate Julia Lee as the recording secretary. So the first we turn to is an amendment to section 4-05 on filing dates for candidates. Now, Julia can go into it in more detail, but essentially the City Council has created a new date on which people seeking office in the city can apply for matching funds, and under the law, before matching funds can be provided, candidates have got to file with the Conflict of Interest Board, the financial disclosure forms. Council established two dates, but there are four dates, and it leaves for us to establish two additional dates for filers. Maybe Julia, you want to expand on that just a bit?
Just as you said, Jeff, there were changes to the administrative law affecting both the annual disclosure law as well as the campaign finance board law, and it's basically to allow candidates to get funding as early as a year prior to the election year. So the new administrative code basically had mandated the Conflicts of Interest Board to create a rule to set deadlines for candidates seeking matching funds who are going to get those matching funds in February, March, and April. So that's what this rule does.
Okay, so as I understand it, we've reviewed this. It has been subject, it's been published, it's been subject to open meetings in accordance of hearing. It's been open to a hearing in accordance with the procedures that are now in place during the emergency. And now it is before us, I think, for adoption as a final rule, after which it would be published. So are there any discussion or amendments proposed to this rule at this point? Well, I hear none. So could we take a vote on the final adoption? All in favor, say aye.
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 And those opposed? Hearing none, the rule is adopted. And I guess now will be published in the city record for 30 days under CAPA. Okay. Let's turn to the next rule and amendment, and this is nothing more than an update of the rules relating to appearances by the members of the City Planning Commission. This rule was adopted a number of years ago, and since then there have been changes in nomenclature and the like. And this rule change is not intended to affect any substantive changes, but simply to update. Is there any discussion? I've got a few comments about it, but why don't we hear from others on the board who have any comments on this proposal?
I had a few, Jeff, and so I'm happy to lead off.
Sure.
And there are little things, and let me say, first of all, congratulations on this updating job. There were some bodies mentioned in the old rule that may not have ever existed, and or if they did, don't exist now. So well done by all. My comments are technical. The staff recommends eliminating 3 definitions, and I would hardly concur with getting rid of 2 of them. But I suggest that there might be value in keeping the definition of a peer. I know it's redundant to what's in the charter itself, but it seems to me that if one of the goals is to make the rule clear, the word appear doesn't, in my mind, convey to the general reader what the definition does, which means any communication for compensation. A peer, I think people think of a peer like a lawyer's formal appearance, some kind of formal step, different from just making a phone call or sending a text to one of these bodies. And without making the thing overlong, I think there's some value, or arguably go the other way and take the word appear out of the rule and use some kind of language like communicate for compensation. I don't know, but I offer that as one, and I'll mention the other two. And in fact, I think the other two have substantially been answered. One was just a question on my part, whether BSA should be in that section that limits prohibited appearances to matters involving zoning or land use. And I just wondered what else there was at BSA, and apparently there are some other things. And so I'm happy leaving that where it is. And then the mention of LDCs at one point in the rule, and that's at 1-09B4. In my mind, LDCs maybe are less important than they were 25 or 30 years ago when this rule was first adopted, but bids have come along, and a bid might in fact be an LDC, I don't know. But my question was whether they are or aren't an LDC, should they be in the rule? And I gather staff may have investigated this and consulted with the Planning Commission, and they're in agreement that LDCs ought to be added. And maybe that's in a new draft. I've lost track of the drafts, but I'd concur in that change.
Well, in terms of the reference to LDCs in the rule as it exists, I believe is intended to cover the Economic Development Corporation.
Certainly for one.
Yeah. But bids, I don't know. Have we considered whether there ought to be a special rule for business improvement districts, which of course are involved in as they say, providing for improvements using money collected from members to improve the districts. But are they involved in land use decisions specifically that the City Planning Commission should be prohibited, or members be prohibited from appearing? I've not looked at that before, and I don't know.
It's a good question, and the main reason it occurred to me was less on that point than just on the fact that they do contract with and get all their money from SBS. The dues that, as I understand it, that the merchants pay, or the assessments that are levied on them, pass through SBS and come to them, I think technically through a contract they have with SBS. This is my recollection. And it's a good question about whether land use matters arise there or not. I suppose if they do, I'd feel a little bit odd about a planning commissioner appearing before a bid on a land use matter. But that's a pretty uninformed view in a long answer to your question.
Yeah. So Wayne, Chris Hammer's done a bit of looking into this question, and that last. I know we've had a bunch of drafts over this the last few days of various things, but he circulated a draft that includes bids, and so maybe Chris could just kind of update people on his work on bids and explaining why we actually agree with your concern and want to include bids in the section you're talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. And so we, I think when your question to us first arose, we did reach out to the Department of City Planning to gauge their sense of, both the role of bids and the, whether bids both, whether they understood bids to be part of both, this rule, whether they understood bids to be, potentially problematic for a city planning commissioner, a part-time city planning commissioner, to appear before, and they concurred with your initial reaction, Wayne, that that bids ought to be part of this rule, that they would consider it a conflict for a commissioner to appear before a bid. Does not appear, I've not found in my research that they have a formal role in the process, but certainly there are public aspects of of zoning matters that that bids could, in theory, take part in, both as lobbying for zoning changes, certainly, lobbying for special districts to be made. And so it would seem consistent with both the spirit of the rule, as you suggest, the mechanism for their funding through the Department of Small Business Services is similar to and consistent with what's been originally contemplated in the rule back a couple of decades ago, before bids really took off. And as creatures of local legislation, bids are also, very similar, if not in fact, local development corporations in name. And so we would, we've, proposed adding a phrase after, any local development corporation, including a business improvement district that has entered into a contract with the city to perform services on behalf of the Department of Small Business Services, so that it's explicitly clear that that this prohibition would apply to bids. The Department of City Planning also cautioned that we should not simply replace local development corporation with business improvement district in order to ensure that that the rule does in fact cover all all local development corporations, whether or not they are created through legislation as a business improvement district.
Are business improvement districts, in fact, local development corporations? Are they incorporated under that section of the law?
They're not. They are nonprofit organizations. They are, but they're not as a technical matter incorporated under the local development corporation law.
Right. So they should be referred to, I guess, separately from local development corporations, not including, but and.
Yes, so maybe in any local development corporation or business improvement district.
Yeah. Anthony, you were going to say something?
No, business improvement districts are defined in the ad code. So yeah, I think that proposal works.
Yeah. The other comment I'd make in connection with that portion of the provision is this was, as I said, intended principally to apply to the Economic Development Corporation. But the Economic Development Corporation, as I understand it, and I do because I was involved in this, it is in fact no longer formally a local development corporation. And there was a proceeding brought by the Attorney General's office, which we resolved. And this is technical, but split the Economic Development Corporation and what we now call the Land Development Corporation. It had to do with whether local development corporations could lobby or not. So I think technically referring to local development corporations doesn't sweep in the EDC. So I suggest when we send this over to the law department and operations, that we ask people to take a look at just the wording here to make sure we're covering the entire universe of entities, especially the Economic Development Corporation. So it's technical, but it merits, I think, looking at.
And Jeff, just so I understand, would the suggestion be that you'd recommend this to cover both those new entities? The two.
It should cover both, but we should make sure that it covers the Economic Development Corporation, which we should probably name specifically.
No, I'm not talking about bids, and I'm not talking about bids in EDC. I'm talking about I guess I don't know what you're calling that, but EDC 1 and EDC 2, which is what we have now, right?
We do, except EDC 1, the principal EDC, is no longer technically a local development corporation. It's a type C corporation. So I think it warrants mentioning EDC, any local development corporation, and bids. So name all of them that way to make sure that is the case. It's a technical matter, but I think we should recognize that. So when we submit it for review, I guess we should ask the law department when they review this to review it for review the language to make sure we're capturing everything we need to capture. So
If that makes sense.
No.
I think it might make sense if the board is amenable to break out the Economic Development Corporation as a separate number, like the Board of Standards and Appeals and the Department of Consumer Affairs, because they've taken on that different legal structure in the last 30 years.
Well, yeah, fewer than 30. Yes. Why don't we try drafting it that way and see how it comes out. Any comments on any of the other portions of this rule?
Well, sorry, Jeff, if we might just, Wayne actually had he commented on two things.
Okay.
One of them being the definitions thing. And so if we could just sort of talk about that for just a moment. The standard that we've used, that the board has used for the last couple of years, and frankly, this actually describes pretty much all of the board's rulemaking, is that the rules don't repeat sections of the city charter. They just implement and interpret them. And so as we've done the rulemakings over the last couple of years, we have not included any repetitious sections of ad code or the city charter and the rules. The idea being you always have to look at both, and that the appropriate place for bringing those things together is in some sort of educational documents, training documents, as we do when we grant waivers, for example, where we cite all the relevant charter sections and rules to a section. And in fact, when the board went back and revised Chapter 9 after the City Council revised the rules for Chapter 9 after the City Council amended Chapter 9, the board actually went in and stripped out some of the repetitive things that we had originally had in there to try to keep our rules as lean as possible, which is, I would also say, is something that the law department and the Mayor's Office of Operations appears to prefer for rulemaking as well. That being said, Wayne's not wrong about the word appear. It's a little confusing for people because it's not intuitive that it necessarily includes compensation. And so it's one of the things that I think maybe is a little more confusing in Chapter 68. In fact, Chapter 68 itself is not internally consistent. It does sometimes talk about paid appearances, which would seem to be redundant. I would suggest maybe we can talk about this, and this is not an option that staff had considered, but Wayne had raised about using some other language in there other than appear, and so maybe that might be an option, like paid communications or something like that, so we don't get into this definitional problem. Or else we've also tried to avoid cross references but maybe this might be a place where just a cross-reference to the definition of a peer might be the way to do it. That way it's not, we don't get into the difficulty of having potentially contradictory versions of the same definition in two different places, but we at least alert the readers of this rule that it is a defined term.
Something like they can't appear as defined in 260 Charter Section 2601, whatever, right?
Yeah, something like that, just so that we're not really repeating it, but at least we're alerting people that it's a defined term and that they need to go look at it. And obviously in educational materials, if we were to create educational materials about this, we would bring all that together in one place. But as far as the rules, which are, you know, intended to be, you have to read them all together. Maybe something like that would be a better, sort of a cleaner option for this and more consistent with the way we've done rulemaking, and it seems like the law department and the Mayor's Office of Operations prefers us to do this. I'm just throwing out some ideas, really.
Yeah, I like that last one. At least somebody who goes to the trouble to read the rule, and I'm not holding my breath that each of the 13 or so members of the commission are going to read these rules, but you know, in seriousness, some will, and you go to that trouble and you think, God, I've done it, and you don't get any heads up at all that appear means something pretty significant. But that carrot in there to the definition works for me.
I've got no problems if the rest of us do not. I know we're removing the reference to the hardship appeals panel, and I understand the hardship appeals panel has never been appointed or never has met, but it was, when it was adopted, something of concern to a number of people in the city. I guess it still is there. I really have no objection to removing it. I guess if it ever sprung into existence, we could amend the law if necessary. But it was adopted early on, and it has not been changed by any subsequent charter revision commission or legislation. It's in the law. I don't know that it hurts to leave it there, but if there's the feeling on staff that in fact it is a little confusing because in fact it does not meet and has in fact not even been appointed, I have no real objection to taking that out.
Yes, and I will add that we did consult with the general counsel of the Landmarks Preservation Commission. And you know, it is you know, to confirm that this is, you know, really a body that exists in name only, that has not, you know, actually had any appointments. And the general counsel also pointed out that it's within the same charter chapter as the Landmark Preservation Commission, and so. You know, and so it would, you know, in theory, if it were to spring up again, or in the first instance, it would still fall within the ambit of the prohibition of the Landmarks Preservation Commission language that that remains in the proposed rule under Board Rule Section 109A7.
I'm not sure I necessarily agree with that analysis by the council there, but again, it doesn't exist. So if we want to clean up the statute, the rule, that I guess that's fine. But it is still there. It's still in the charter and could re-arise. The other nomenclature issue is the Public Design Commission, which I think still is officially the Art Commission under law. I think the name has never been formally changed.
It's been, sorry. Go ahead.
I don't believe so. Maybe at least looking at it myself, I don't see that the title of the entity has been changed in law.
It's been changed by executive order in 2008, but not in the charter administrative code.
In the charter itself. So maybe we could put Art Commission in parentheses if we wanted to, but again, we know what it is that we're referring to in this law, and if the nomenclature were ever changed again, we could revert to it. So I'm okay with these changes. I would like to see some look at the LDC issue when we submit it for review. Any other comments?
You could just put Art Commission / Public Design Commission, and that would,
Yeah, that's the way to do it.
I think that's the way to do it.
Okay, we can certainly do that.
No, that works. Any other comments, suggestions, proposals? Okay, so I'm going to go for a vote on, I guess, going to the next step, which Julia is, well, it would come back to the board, I guess, with those changes in language, right? Or proposed changes, or?
So it's up to the board. There are two options would be, one, to come to the board, return to the board at next month's meeting with a fresh copy with all of these changes that have been discussed included, or alternatively, we could submit it to the law department for its formal review. The law department has taken a look at this initially to and provided some helpful comments on the rule, but they've not done their formal review, of course. And certainly when they do that, we can point them towards the local development corporation issue that's been raised. And so that would be the second option, would be to present it to the law department and the mayor's office of operations for its certification. That would, with the edits that they suggest, would come back to the board before a public hearing. And so either way is either one of those two options is certainly something to work with.
If we did the latter with instruction that they specifically look at the LDC question, and then they returned it to us, it would save a step. Right? It wouldn't have to come back here, so I think that would be more efficient to do it that way. So if the board concurs with that procedure, I ask for a vote. All in the affirmative on this?
I approve.
Aye. Anyone disapproving? So why don't we proceed with that? I guess this ends the open meeting portion of our meeting. So